So hello, everybody. Welcome. This is our A+ Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms webinar. And this one is on a very, very special topic, which we think is transformative and very exciting, which is social protection, automated decision-making, and procurement. So believe it or not, it's very hard to look at that title and think about how that could be exciting and transformative, but if you spend an hour with us, you're going to see how that is possible. So actually, how can private and public sector AI be leveraged to ensure more AI and automated decision-making, which we call ADM, or unbiased? And could they even correct for historic exclusion and inequity? And how can we use procurement as a leverage to incentivize inclusion and the influence of feminists in the conception, the budgeting, the design, the deployment, and the monitoring of these systems? So we're here to sort of tease out how we can ensure that the solutions are designed in a manner that's human-centric and context-specific rather than tech solutionist, designed and implemented to enhance and protect individual and group continuity and coherence. So we have two very extraordinary people with us here today that I'm very grateful are joining us. There's Carina Lopes, who works at the Mobile World Capital Barcelona, where she's head of Digital Future Society think tank. And that's a research and deliberative arm of the Digital Future Society program that convenes international experts to explore and propose actionable recommendations on the future of work, digital divides, data governance, and tech and climate emergencies. Previously, she was at the D-Lab as a program manager responsible for strategy and setup. And at CityMart, she led innovation projects with cities like Barcelona, Moscow, and Athens, and local government teams in the US, South Africa, Japan, and Brazil. So extremely well-rounded and worldly. And thank you, Carina, for joining us. We're very excited to have you here. Also with us is Helani Galpaya, CEO of Learn Asia, which is a pro-poor, pro-market think tank working on digital and other infrastructure policy issues across the Asia Pacific. She researches and engages in public discourse on issues related to net neutrality, policy and regulatory barriers in internet access, e-government, algorithms, bias, and inclusion. And at present, she's researching how digitization creates new forms of formalization, exclusion, and inclusion under pandemic shutdowns. So she's become a COVID-19 expert. She serves on the board of editors of the Information Technology and International Development Journal, on the board of directors of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and a member of the multi-stakeholder advisory group of the UN Internet Governance Forum. Also, currently working on the working group on innovation and commercialization of the Global Partnership on AI, GPAI. And thank you so much, Helani, for being here with us too. So also another extremely worldly, multilateral person that is going to give us a perspective that's really terribly well-rounded. So just to begin, because procurement is, what is it? Let's set the landscape on a short definition of what it is and how it's been working until now. And perhaps, Carina, you can take that for us.
Well, let me start by thanking you and Helani. It's a pleasure to be with two wonderful women. I really admire both of your work, and I think it's great to have the opportunity to have the discussion today. Public procurement has been and will be a tool for defining markets, for defining government strategies, and also shape society. It's a really, really powerful tool. OCDE says that it goes from 15 to 30% of GDP, depending on countries. In Europe, the average, what we have is about 19% in Europe. We have 11% of GDP in US is public procurement, and the average OECD is about 13%. So we're talking about a great tool to shape how the markets work and to influence also trends and ways of doing. One example that is a bit more mature is what Europe has done with the green procurement, which is a group of the tools and definitions that help local governments and central governments to buy and purchase services, but also products that are aligned with the strategy, the green strategy for Europe. And I think also with the Green Deal and this twinning of the digitalization and sustainability, climate emergency, we'll see more and more the procurement being used as this kind of strategic tool to influence the market. When it comes to our discussion today, we think it's crucial. Why? There's different ways that government can really put procurement at the service of society, but also the gender issues. The way they buy services, so what type of service they are buying, and that includes this gender perspective, but also the way, the companies that they are buying from, the way that, for example, they employ women. And Barcelona is an example. In 2016, they launched what they called social procurement guidebook, where it kind of indicates what type of conditions the companies that the city council hires for services and products, what type of conditions they should give to their workers. And there are a couple of lines about gender equality, and also life-work balance, and the importance of having this time and the regulation of timetables for women to have to take care of their caring responsibilities. So these are examples, but there are other examples how it could be used as a strategic tool, and I'm sure today we'll be able to kind of go a bit more in detail about these examples.
Okay, that's great. So just to follow on that, just what are some of the big picture opportunities to change procurement, do you think, Helani?
So as Carina said, first, it's great to be here and see some of you again. As Carina said, I mean, if we are talking about what a society should be, who should be included, who should have the opportunity to be in certain places, who had been historically disadvantaged, and how we allocate resources across these groups or people. This is the fundamental job of a government. I mean, taxation is all about redistribution. Procurement is a big part of it because a lot of the services that allocate resources across different groups are procured and done through, let's say, ICT systems. A government might decide that small, medium enterprises are worth promoting and therefore can use procurement rules to allocate small amounts of marks for small, medium enterprises or Black-owned businesses or women-owned businesses. And there is a whole sort of trail of case studies of how government procurement enabled local companies to innovate. Not only is there case studies, there's also systematic quantitative modeling that supports the idea that government procurement, when used in the right way, can enable innovative companies to get ahead without compromising the value for money, because obviously we are also trying to procure services from a large enough pool, including international suppliers, and get the best value deal for taxpayers and so on. So that is important, but that it is possible to combine both of these. I think it's relatively evident. What we've seen it, as Carina said, in sort of, in inclusive, sort of bringing women into the table. I've seen it in bringing small, medium enterprises. So that it is a tool for making societies better is, I think, quite clear. And a lot of times, as Carina said, the amount of budgets, that are allocated are far bigger. For example, in a South Asian country, the procurement budget is so much bigger than the women's empowerment budget, right? So you have to do some of that through procurement. I think importantly, it has the ability to set norms. So in a nascent area where you are purchasing, let's say, ICT systems to do something, where there aren't a lot of stuff happening in that country, government is one of the big anchor buyers and maybe one of the first buyers. You really can define what are the rules, what are the ethics, who's at the table, and it can set norms. So I think it's really a timely conversation to have in terms of procurement.
All right, thank you. And you've teed up exactly, because now that we actually have it's a fabulous definitions and conceptual contextualization of procurement. It's now let's go and see what design of automated decision making or algorithms might be in this context. I'd love to also hear about some unforeseen consequences, Carina.
Well, we can look at the case that has been quite well known this year, that has been well spoken, which is the Siri case, the Dutch case, and we can look at how it was designed and also how it's been evolved. No, but the Siri case is a system risk. Are you okay?
Yes, I'm fine. I'm realizing actually that I kind of skipped over, like, I'm also looking at a definition about ADM and about algorithms. And maybe
okay, sorry.
Just no, it's all me jumping around. But I'm wondering whether, Helani, you just want to look at this about how algorithms would play into that provision of social protection.
So I mean, broadly, I suppose, you know, first is the word, the phrase social protection, and I would include broadly any kind of money that government spends on its people that is meant to make their lives better, keep them fed, get them educated, and so on. But specifically, we could think about, obviously, you know, sort of the public education, public health systems, payment of pensions, payment of disability benefits, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, algorithmic decision-making algorithms, or ADM, I think it's quite, this is a very broad term we are using. Somewhere in there is probably the kind of very low-tech, simple things which have been now done for years, like, you know, getting 1,000 CVs online and then running a scan to find, you know, keywords and how many times they occur and selecting the top 100 CVs, right? That's an algorithm, a computer program going through a database, straight out data mining activity. Slightly more sophisticated, you could think, and there are a million examples, but not just looking at the 1,000 database CVs or resumes that you've got, but now going and scrolling through people's social media feeds and picking up keywords and combining that, multiple data sources, and then recommending the top 10 CVs. Going further, you could think of live systems, for example, like, you know, I mean, one of my favorite cases of all what can go wrong is Virginia Eubanks, who talks, you know, in Allegheny County about how 29 government programs and the data from all of that was combined to give some kind of predictor, early predictor of child abuse happening, and then humans acting on that information. So that's a lot more complicated. That's pure statistical. There's no learning involved. Statistical correlations being combined together and saying, okay, this child has a score of this. Now, at the other extreme is the machine learning based algorithms, right? Where an algorithm, that set of rules is written, a large amount of data is fed into the algorithm, then the model is able to learn and then the next time predict what's happening. So the classic examples in computer science are image recognition, right? An algorithm fed a large number of images of, let's say, animals or objects and so on, and it keeps learning, improving the weights and getting better at identifying edges, and the next time it's presented with a picture it hasn't seen before, is able to identify. So that's the model is learning itself. So this whole range I would include under algorithmic decision making.
Okay, so that's great. Now to bring us into the work that you've done, digging deep, Carina, into ways that this has played out in very specific programs that we've been able to study now.
Yes, so when we start looking at the algorithm, and because the algorithm, you know, in certain courses can seem like this very abstract notion, we start looking at what were usually the three areas where you have to really kind of put your attention and where issues start coming up. So the first one is the data sets, and then we start also identifying problems with the process of this decision making, and finally also the design, no, and the interaction with the user. I don't know if you'd like me to explain a little bit more about these three areas and then give you specific examples, or should I jump into an example and then go back to these areas? But for example, going back to the case I was going to mention earlier, the Siri case, the Dutch case, I think it plays well these three examples. So the system risk indicators was a system designed by the Dutch government that started being in place in 2014. and it's just been blocked at early 2020 by the Dutch government, and it is no longer in place. But what this system did was start combining data sets from different departments and areas of the government, of the Dutch government, and start putting it together. And the municipalities. So this was data gathered at the government level, central government level, and then municipalities could request to use this software and run it on specific neighborhoods to identify possible fraudsters. And the cases where this software was being run was low-income neighborhoods, to see people that were committing fraud in relation to welfare payments. So the reason why this system has been blocked is based on privacy and the lack of the fair use. So it was decided by the court that the social benefits of using this system, that was like a magnifying glass over a specific neighborhood, in terms of what the number of possible fraud they were identifying, was not proportional. And also because it was creating a lot of false positives, in the sense that, for example, one of the things that will raise a flag was like if you were consuming less water than what they assume you should be consuming. That might say that you're not living at the house where government is paying your support to for the housing, but you were living somewhere else. So we might say that you might have more than one house, or that you live in a couple and not as a single. So that was one of the items that they were looking at, is what water consumption. And if it was within the thresholds that government had set up, a flag would be raised. Now, why this is a problem? First, no one really knows how many data sets they were using. There was a risk assessment done by department on the data sets, but no one did a risk assessment on the entire data sets. When they were putting together into a new data set, what would happen, what will be the social and economic impact. Then in terms of the decision making, government never allowed and never opened to the court how that decision making was happening. So what was the elements that will raise the flag? You know, you would be flagged because based on the intellectual property. So usually we end up having the same, you know, argument. We cannot disclose the algorithm because of intellectual property of the private sector, of the provider that designed this system to us. And secondly, if we tell publicly how this system works, then citizens will understand how we understand what they are doing. So that was the other challenge. And the third one, in terms of use is that we always end up having these very surveilling type, big brother type systems applied on very vulnerable communities. And usually what these systems do is the moment you are flagged, and until your case is solved, you stop receiving support from government. So the impact that it has on someone's life for the weeks or months that you're waiting for this case to be solved is massive, because you're already in a very vulnerable situation. And this is a pattern that we have found, not looking at the Dutch case, but also some of the cases we've been looking at, and in specific looking at gender challenges within these same systems.
I have some things to say, but I'd love to hear about some more examples from the Global South. If you have some to weigh in on, Helani. You're muted.
Sorry. We are actually struggling to find good examples from the Global South. So we know, for example, we have the early workings of studyable cases. So for example, the same software that Virginia Eubanks studies extensively in Pennsylvania in terms of child abuse is now actually being used in one of the South American countries. And that procurement went ahead sort of without a whole lot of consultation. Now, has it given adverse effects? No, yet. I'm sorry, we don't know yet, right? So we, sort of the studyable examples are actually hard, but, we have the opportunities for that with, lots of countries doing ID card systems. We certainly have plenty of developed country examples in the UK, for example, being, the education, the GCSE results, the grade 10 results being sort of, highly controversial and negatively discriminating good students from historically low performing schools, while positively discriminating not so good students, but from historically well performing schools, right? And the controversy that caused.
So what's really interesting to me too about that is that's the model design, right? So we have two things, just to sort of go back to our original definitions. We have the data sets, which may come from a very small subset in the global north that are being applied in the north, but also in the south, where it actually, the data is not localized or not topped up synthetically to include people. But on top of that, we have models that are being conceived for, in the case of Carina's example, but I think all about fraud. It's all about this idea of efficiency, of just catching people in the act. And I don't think any of us have anything against that. That's perfectly great. But if you conceive a model and that's its only purpose, then it doesn't do other things that a model could conceivably do, which is to provide effectiveness, to better quality of service, therefore a better quality of life, if you're only looking for fraud, because it's sort of a negative instinct. And I think one of the things that we've all started to see is that, you know, where's the right to challenge? That people have not really felt either educated and empowered to challenge, but even if they do challenge, as in Carina's very specific example, there's no, one is told that the software is proprietary, it's intellectual, it's protected under intellectual property rules, and therefore you can't challenge it at all. So we'll go into a little bit later about how algorithmic impact assessments that go to the life cycle of any algorithm or automated decision-making could be one route to opening this up, but I just wanted to bring that up about this right to challenge and things being proprietary, because I think it's pretty scary. And also that governments don't have to sign proprietary license agreements. They have a tremendous amount of, they have a platform from which to negotiate with big companies. So I just wanted to bring that in. So going into this, Carina, this work that you've done at Digital Future Society on designing human-centric and context-specific automated decision-making, do you want to speak more about what you've uncovered in your other research?
Well, I can touch quite a few points. Before to start going a little bit more in detail, I think it's really important that we understand how the systems that we have now and the relationship that governments have with the private sector is not something that is new. What is part of our research is that we've been looking at this process of early 90s digitalization and outsourcing, and outsourcing specific IT processes and getting rid of your IT teams. And now what we have, the last wave of digitalization, is called the digital transformation, where your citizen is your client, is your user. And what you want is a digitally enabled citizen, where you also pass some of the requirements and some of the work and responsibility for your citizen. And that's a huge topic that we can also talk about, and why that's problematic, specifically problematic in welfare services and women. We have touched on a few things related with that in our research. But, you know, with the issue of passing procurement to the private sector, especially on very sensitive and public-facing topics, is really problematic. Because if you think how how public sector works, you know, when it comes to procurement, what you have your procurement technicians will do is design the specifications of the service you're looking for. And usually the mandate to have from your manager will be that you have to reduce the cost, you have to be more efficient, and you have to streamline the processes. We have to reduce the amount of personnel that needs to do admin work in the back office. So all of that you can understand from a kind of a private sector perspective, but when it's the public sector having this as a starting point to deliver very sensitive services, then the results end up being quite often quite big disaster. And Philip's Alston report for the UN last year on digitalization of welfare highlighted this, and how we kind of stumbling into a kind of disaster zone with the digitalization of welfare services, not only because we are taking the human, the caseworker out of the picture, but also we are passing all the responsibility of trying to understand how the system works, how you can appeal to that system, and how you can get your problem solved to the citizen who is asking you for support because of the vulnerable situation they have. I don't know if you want, for example, I can talk about the UK universal credit example. I think that's another quite well-known case, but it's quite interesting because I think it shows how this kind of digitalization and streamline and becoming efficient becomes an issue. So the universal credit is a system where different support systems that British government had in place were channeled into one system. So instead of the household receiving tax credit for the children, housing support or employment benefits, suddenly there is one thing that is called the universal credit that is all channeled through one bank account to the family. So you stop being the individual for the government, and you become like a family, a household, and everything about that household gets under the magnifying glass of government. But this system has exposed a lot of vulnerability, especially with women. Not only, I found it extremely problematic that for example, unemployment support is something that is individual, but then when it gets channeled into this, it goes to the main, so you get one single payment to the main bank account. So it takes a lot of, and that bank account by default is for the male, is a male bank account. The system was designed by default to be for the male bank account. So it takes the financial autonomy of women out. And if you, in the case you want that bank account to be not the default bank account, but another bank account, or that the payment is split, you have to justify why the payment needs to be split. And for example, if you are in a household where it's like family violence, gender violence, you'll be logged into a database that identifies you as a female victim of gender violence. So, it's just it's like, when I look at this case, it's just like the issues start piling up, and the complexities of really understanding what is at play here, and how you generate support from governments to understand why this goes against the objective that you had, that is not facilitating or benefiting the user or your client with a better service, but you actually just ingraining and the deepening up some of the discriminations that your citizens were already facing. And just one point, because I also don't want to extend, we can go in more detail if you want into this case, but one of the elements that have been very highlighted mostly by the activists and also academics is the rape exception. So this type of benefit only applies up to 2 children. So families, if having 3 or more kids, they won't get extra benefits for having more kids. So that's what they say, is like, it's your option. You have to have the financial resources to deal with that. And the only other way, there are a couple of exceptions, but one of them that has been very contested is the rape clause. So if you can demonstrate that your 3rd child is the result of a rape, you can get support for that 3rd child. The problem is, when you look at the data, actually nearly, it's almost like 3/3 of rapes in UK, they are either committed by a partner, ex-partner, or someone within the family. And very of these cases actually end up being made public. So, imagine living with your rapist and trying to argue why you want additional economic support, but also that money goes to the same single account. So it's like a loophole. It's like a continuous trap that as a woman in a very vulnerable or extreme situation is very hard to get out of. And we could go really deep in this case, because I think there's a lot of aspects of this digitalization process that they've gone, that are problematic for the issues that we are discussing today.
Yeah, and I think what they all have, these horrible loops, have in common is that they were models that were designed without any community interaction, not asking the people who are the beneficiaries. Because, as you also mentioned before, the city, in the other case of the Netherlands, didn't want to reveal how they were going to catch people making fraud. So therefore, if you don't want to tell the fraudsters how you're doing it, you're not going to consult with them about what the actual software will be. But the fact of the matter is, if you're providing services, in order to be effective, you want to have a conversation with the people who are receiving services and understand, you know, the user journey and all these things that we know about good software development that are kind of left out of this. So things that may have seemed like a good idea at the time, because I suppose on the face of it, doesn't it make sense? Oh, well, one bank account will streamline it. How terribly efficient. Sounds good to me. But then the way that it plays out really is about perpetuating a system, which is really interesting. So leading to you, Helani, exactly. So how would sort of a community-led, gender-inclusive pilot look like in a city, in a municipality, if you consulted with the beneficiaries?
So I think probably, to me, the first starting point would be a very clear understanding and putting down on paper on what you're actually trying to do. That is, what is it that you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to save costs? Fine, say that. How is the current system working? Who's in and who's out? And what other social engineering are you trying to do? Are you trying to make it more fairer, bring people in who are not in, and so on? I think it's important to be explicit about the objectives and put that out to public scrutiny, and to understand how the current system is working. And let's not at all think that this is an automation problem only, right? I mean, manual human systems are incredibly biased, right? Like all these examples we're talking about could be done without a single computer or a bit or a byte and end up with the worse or same outcomes, right? So being explicit about what you're trying to optimize, because and we know that it's sometimes not possible to optimize on every single variable, like socioeconomic inclusion and gender inclusion and disability inclusion may or may not be possible depending on what you're trying to do. So you need to sort of be explicit. I think the second step is then to build in the checks and balances for the different points of this whole procurement and going live and the later feedback process. So checks and balances might include things like who gets to bid and what kind of partnerships should be at the table in that market of suppliers, for example. Do they have to consult with the community? Is a local community-based partner a must, and what is their role? Or can we bring in the local community and civil society as a parallel observer, auditor, verifier of truth? Those are two different models, but those both work. Who's at the table? What level of explainability of what you're trying to do, how the model is working, at what stage? So at a very technical stage, the level of explanation is quite different from at a later stage. Third, what kind of testing, piloting, trying out is allowed? So is the code transparent and open source? Is that a requirement? And if not, can we at least do black box testing? That is, you don't understand the inner workings, but you throw things in and see what comes out and see if it is highly biased. Is it better than the manual system? Do you ask for parallel runs? If you're automating an existing system, you keep the existing system instead of a pilot, but you do a parallel run of the automated system. Now countries are, sort of thinking about these things, so you can see what kind of improvement, what are we giving up and what are we gaining? We're getting a 6% improvement, but we're leaving 10% of the most vulnerable out, right? Then fourth, I think to me, really, and this is, I don't know how to do it, is that point again at every position of, once it's procured and you've done the system requirements, or once you've done the testing, once you've done the piloting, or once you've gone live 5 years after that, to keep your feedback loops alive. So you have not only the money to go back and correct problems with your model, but also the political will and the contractual ability to put a stop to a system that's hugely biased. And that's problematic. That partly depends on how you build the actual contract with the vendor, but also really depends on the rule of law. Like in the Dutch government, if you can go to the courts and get some sort of, relief that you can put a stop to this. That's a huge thing. Many people are not empowered to go to a court system and say my benefits were refused because of that. So who can speak for them? What's the level of governance? So I think there's a whole lot of things there to unpack.
Okay, there's a lot that's really interesting. If you just, so to simplify these incredible ideas, would it just is like sort of an iterative feedback loop completely, as well as a sort of like a circuit breaker, some point where you're just saying this is actually not doing what we want to do. You'd spoken yesterday, I thought it was very, very interesting, just saying contracts don't work like that, right? People want to deliver so it's once you start, it just keeps on going, and there's never any way to really just like put a full stop to it. So if we, if we start living in this more human-centric world, in this more human-centered design world, how do we think it could change delivery of social protection to the general population? Do we have an idea? Carina, have you thought about that?
Well, there are different ways where we can become, more gender balanced when it comes to welfare services, but also, all the public procurement. As I was saying earlier, there are different ways where you can bring gender perspective into procurement, not only about how you're delivering the service, how you include the voices of the people that you are trying to deliver the service for, how you get the vendors to be fairer in terms of gender equality, but also how to get more companies that are designing services, being led by women, because we also want that perspective. But in terms of, how that can change, I think one thing that is, is like a repetition, it's like a pattern that we always find. We don't have the voice of the final user. I want to go to this, for example, imagine the UK universal credit case. I want to hear these women, that I want them to tell me first, how can I support you? That actually, if the objective of the government was to get you, to activate you, so the idea that you also find is not just efficiency, is that you want to activate people in a set. What that means bluntly is, I want you to go out and get a job. So I don't want you to be fully dependent for years and years on benefits. I want to go out and get a job and be productive part of the society, that's how you put it, kind of black and white. So if that is your objective, let your citizens tell you also how that support might come in. Yesterday I was mentioning, and that's one of the issues that is coming up more and more around the COVID. So it's like lots of the problems that are related to these systems are social problems, structural problems that were already there, and that these benefits are not going to solve, and sometimes just perpetuating. But for example, when it comes to women, one of the biggest issues is care. The caring infrastructure. Who is going to looking after your children for you to be able to go to work? Who is going to look after the elderly? Look at the situation we have in Europe with our elders and the caring homes. But also, all these tasks that women do in society that are not recognized. So most of the challenges we found with the digitalization of welfare services is that they do not account to that reality of women. They tend to be very qualitative, so based on kind of numbers, how much income you're doing, how regular, how many hours you work, and don't take into account if you are a single mom, you might do gig work, no? You might do some cleaning and work in a restaurant and sometimes do some babysitting. I don't know, you're trying to make it work, to make ends meet at the end of the month. So when you try to enter this design box, you just don't fit. Your reality just doesn't fit that kind of stable, pattern-oriented, average-oriented box. And I think that's the biggest challenge. How do we design these systems that take into account the diversity of people's lives, but also their challenges, their daily challenges?
Right. That's really interesting. I wonder if that's actually something that really high-level data science could help with, right? Because it's supposed to be able to deal with the kinds of complexities, as opposed to making things so simple that there's only one or two paths. And I'm also wondering what areas do you think, Helani here, could benefit most from that kind of approach? I mean, is it food subsidy? Is it school allocation? Is it pension? Is it cash transfers?
So, I mean, just going back to, systems being able to handle it. Yes, absolutely. I think if the intentionality is there, there's a whole field of study looking at positive outliers, for example, right? People working on data science are working on this. So I think the easy route is, like Carina was saying, to try to fit people into boxes, because it's very easy to deliver services to the 5 categories that you identify. The real hard part is to say, okay, 5% are outliers at the 2 ends. Now let me really understand them. The data is very sparse on them, so this machine correlations isn't going to work. You actually now need to look at really what's going on there, right? So that's a completely different approach to relying on those macro numbers. It's actually a much more human-centric, ethnographic, and qualitative approach to things. So I think given the work we're doing right now, one of the prime areas where I wish we had a lot of data and lots of qualitative research as well as numbers is on individuals and families and at the margins of the poverty line. So to me, that's a huge area, because the current ways in many countries of giving conditional, unconditional, various forms of cash handouts have existed for a long time. But what we know is, with the COVID kind of situation, people would have just fallen off the edge, maybe multiple times, and come back with each shutdown. We have no way of identifying the newly poor who just fell down below, right? Because the systems don't, the feedback from the ground up is not fast enough, right? And there are some ways of predicting, again, with all the imperfections, right? That kind of area could really benefit at the moment with a sort of a data-driven approach, as long as, again, we are conscious about the problems of that approach.
Exactly. Wow. Carina, do you have something to say about that? Or to just...
Yeah, if I can just add, because as part of the research we've been doing these months, we actually have been working with 9 designers looking at possible solutions. So instead of just saying, okay, let's try to convince governments to stop using these systems, we accept that digitalization will go ahead and these type of systems will be implemented. So we've been looking at how can we improve. And we touch in some of the issues we're talking about here, and the 3 proposals that came up, but I think one of them is very relevant to what we are saying. So one of the proposals is the default matter, but it's about having an advisory board. Who is missing? Sorry. So who is missing is about having an advisory board that really tries to understand, so different personalities, academics, experts, people working on grassroots level, and try to understand what is the information that you don't know about the people, your beneficiaries. So helping governments, having an advisory board that helps governments to understand the data sets they have and where are the gaps of that data sets. Because as Helani is correctly saying, it's really, really difficult sometimes to identify the needs and who are the people that you are trying to address these services to, unless you really understand what's happening at the grassroots root level. And with the COVID, it's it's going to be a huge challenge for governments, exactly for this reason, to understand who has gone through this threshold, who've just been able to kind of get by in last few years, never been under the radar of social services. And in Barcelona, there's been already quite important cases related to this, people that have never been under the social services radar, and suddenly they are in extreme need and they don't even know where to go, because they actually never had to interact with the government before. And the systems have not been designed to give support to these families, because, they were okay. But now we have an extreme situation, because certain sectors have been closed for months and months to no end, and all the safety nets that these communities have gone. So how do we adapt to that? And having people from the ground is really, really important. The second is, now you actually can design systems that benefit or try to mitigate some of the biases, and they are open source data sets that especially with the with the language learning, natural language processing, that try to feed this to mitigate these biases. And I think that's also very, very interesting. And the other proposal that came out with this designers work that we've been doing and the technologist was to design an appealing data institute. So, you know, one is the challenge of appealing. When something goes wrong, who is going to represent your voice? And that's always a big problem. The Dutch case, it was very successful because it was a strategy by activists that spent years and years pushing it forward, because otherwise, you know, no one would know about it and will still be using, unless they had used a kind of strategic litigation strategy to really put it on the map, all the organizations that work on these topics at global level. So we propose to create like a appealing institute, data institute, that not only takes care of this data, but also looks at patterns and looks at what are the issues more related with the certain services, no? So like all the false positives, because that's often is where the problems start, is all the false positives and how you kind of overrule that decision, because the machine says no, there is not a human person to deal with your case, and you call the call center and you just get into a loop trap that you don't know how to get out. And maybe, you know, you don't even have enough minutes to keep calling to the call center to get it sorted, you know. And then we get all the because we're talking about situations of extreme vulnerability, so it's not, you know, the challenges that the beneficiaries face are just enormous.
And may I add something very quickly, because I so identify with this issue of, you know, really what data we are feeding into these systems, because a lot of times what we're doing is using proxies for what we think is the real world, right? The data is not the real world. It's some proxy indicator of something. So, you know, in child abuse, it was sort of, you know, one of the variables is the number of calls received. Well, that's not really an indicator. It's an indicator of how nosy or how involved your neighbors are about sounds, right? Not of child abuse. Combined with other things, it could be a proxy. So I think we need to be careful. It's like asking in Asia, who's the head of the household? And invariably it'll be the man who ticks the box. But if you ask who makes decisions about food, about X, Y, and Z, now you might get to hear a lot more women's voices and actually realize, you know, who actually makes decisions. And I think, you know, this issue of like the Appeals Institute, you know, like I was talking to, you know, these people who do national surveys in Brazil on a lot of things. They hire a large survey company to do the survey, but they also hire a separate company to audit the quality of that. Now that's money actually goes into this activity, right? Yet we have, I think, sort of mental blocks if we talk about we're going to automate a whole social welfare system and we are going to appoint a committee and pay them, and they're going to be civil society and have the citizens' interest in mind, and we are actually going to pay them to be in that process and, you know, find biases, go through the court system and so on. Civil society is dependent on donor money to do this, right? But why not part of the procurement money? Surely that's the improvement feedback loop that actually helps the system.
Yeah, and that's part of the famous monitoring and evaluation, right? That we know so much from funding things. But it's also a very fabulous idea, but so almost counter-intuitive to what we think of as bureaucracies, right? Which bureaucracies' natural function, their entropy is towards, you know, supporting and defending the system. And how interesting to jujitsu it and have a part of the bureaucracy whose job is to poke holes in the system and improve the system and advocate for the beneficiaries as opposed to distance from. It's a great idea. I love these two things all together. You know, as we're going to this sort of innovation economy, and we know that post-COVID, we're going to be having a world where more and more things are automated as we're more and more distanced. I mean, I'm wondering, you know, how actually you really deal with that, right? About public interest accountability. Are you also thinking about how ways that we could build that into the actual contracts in AI?
Well, we haven't looked at how to, you know, change the way contracts are going to be designed, but I definitely think that we need to have a way for appealing. It's one of the areas I think it's always it's always one of the main demands. You need to have a way of going and telling someone that this is not working or I'm being not fairly treated. But also, for me, this data institute should be the same organization that should be looking at what is the algorithm doing. If governments feel uncomfortable to open to the public the algorithm and how the source code, what's happening, you have to allow certain organizations to challenge that algorithm. There must be an organization that at national level can challenge what you are doing and the way you are doing. So I think a way forward, it might be what Helani, we already mentioned this yesterday and you brought it up today again. Maybe the solution is to have allocated as part of the cost of your contract of the system, a bunch of money for, appealing, challenging system that you're going to have to make sure that there's this accountability, traceability, and transparency. Because, all these are very, very beautiful words, accountability, traceability, transparency, but how do we practice them? And I can understand some of the challenges sometimes governments face and in their relation with also with the private sector, but also when they're trying to understand, how to catch the outliers in the work they are doing. I can understand some of the reasoning behind it, but we need to have something in place that kind of protects. That assures me as a citizen that my data is being used in the correct way, that this system is treating me fairly. If the machine says no, then someone is going to raise the hand in my name, because my name as an individual is very, it's a very weak voice. As these are collective systems, they are designed for the collective. So you as an individual, for this system, we don't count. You are like not even, a tiny percentage.
I totally agree all about the appeals in there too. And I think in concert with the front end, which is actually asking citizens, also known as beneficiaries, of what they need from a system. And maybe even those same systems, as everything gets automated, maybe those same citizens get to be part of the appeals board too. The people who have helped design the system can help their other citizens through the whole process. Because I think we have to challenge the model as well. Helani, look like, yeah.
I was going to say, I think another important part to what Carina is saying is the automatic assumption of publicness of certain decisions that come out. So at routine intervals, every month, every year, whatever, the privacy preserving ways of making some of the decisions that are made by the system public, the number of appeals and complaints public, the type of demographics of who's appealing and so on. Because at some point, Carina, what we were talking about, this individual is just one person who thinks, oh, I must be the problem. When you realize actually either that person or a civil society organization who represents that interest realizes actually there's 1,000 people with a systematic characteristic that is being biased, that's very different. But you won't know about it until you have certain open data rules also to go hand in hand, right? Because otherwise it's a big black box and you're waiting for a right to information kind of query when you have a hunch. The other thing is, other than the feedback loop from people who've been disenfranchised or, sort of discriminated against, there can also just be like or sort of like audits that the system itself does or outside parties do without any provocation from people who've been left out of the system. And that can be quite routine. We do annual audits of our accounts. Why not, once you reach some kind of critical mass, certain types of audits that go on.
No, it's totally critical to have iterative audits of the algorithms, because we also know, obviously, with machine learning, it's going to go places that you don't anticipate. So there's no hard stop. It's not like you built a building and then every now and then you expect to see it's not cracking and crumbling. It's actually an organism. You've created something that's a living, breathing thing. I would like to just sort of bring in for a second this idea of using procurement as a lever to actually create an innovation economy for female entrepreneurs and their collaborators, and what that would mean if there were set-asides for female founders to create some of these systems, and how we might be able to use that. So does somebody want to take that forward?
Well, I can start, and maybe Helani can also tell us a little bit some of the cases she mentioned yesterday. But you know, for me, I always like to look at the parallels, you know, and things that have already been tested. We know that we work. Let's try and do kind of knowledge transfer. So, for example, going back to Barcelona, in early 2000s, Barcelona became quite well known as being kind of a smart cities leading at global scale. And I think one of the projects that they had that was most interesting was the innovation challenges that then they turn into innovation procurement, where you'd go to the market and say, I have this problem. Instead of telling the market I need, I don't know, some traffic lights that do A, B, or C, they would go with the problem, tell what the problem was, open it to a call for interest, and they receive proposals and then help companies to finish developing their product. It could be, it didn't have to be a very well advanced product, and then they'll do pilots in the city. And you know, if you think about these, if you have specific problems or areas that as a government, you know, are like sensitive issues in terms of citizens, open it to the public, see what comes up, then put the fundings to start generating, you know, these business opportunities, and do it on a regular basis, and you'll see the results. And it might be that in 5 years you have 10, 15, 20 vendors that are female-led and that are dealing with a specific issue that is not going, most likely it's not going to be specific just to your city or to your national government, because they are, you know, we see patterns when you go to other countries. You know, the challenges always tend to be very, very similar when it comes to our experiences as citizens and in our relationship with the governments.
Yeah. Helani?
I guess I agree with what Carina is saying. And in addition to that, I would say you can sort of be quite explicit and mandate some of these things in your things like your procurement marking scheme. So, you know, 15 years ago when Sri Lanka was doing a whole lot of like e-government, you know, that first wave of automation of government services, there's a huge debate around how there are no local companies who have, you know, because obviously procurement benefits people who have done it before, right? That's a risk mitigation strategy. There are no local companies who have done it before. So how are we ever going to build our local ICT sector? So then one of the mandates was, let's allocate, I can't remember, some small number, 5% or to having a local partner, or maybe even mandate having a local partner. And it's very interesting because in the early days, the local partner is no more than a mailbox sometimes, or doing level 1 technical support once the system goes live. But for the second, third, fourth government procurement, they actually become significant value-added players. And then you actually see them going and working in Africa, doing similar systems, because now they have a reference clients, the World Bank and the ICT agency of Sri Lanka. We did this, yes, with a partner, and so on. So, you know, we know this kind of thing works. So if it is, for example, women-owned businesses that we want to encourage and innovators, I think we can be explicit about it. However, this doesn't automatically happen just because you allocate 5% of the marks, because another thing we noticed again from back in the day was that actually local firms just didn't know how to fill the 60-page World Bank procurement document, right? They were getting disqualified on technicalities, not because they were proposing a bad system. So then the procurement people actually held workshops for the local people on just how to get through the boring technical details, because that's really important, you know, how you put things into the 2 envelopes instead of 1, like basic stuff like that. So that we need, right? Because we can't assume that these women entrepreneurs have participated in government paperwork heavy government procurement systems. Third is actually creating the opportunities for foreign firms and local firms to actually meet and create partnerships, you know, whether it's trade shows or other ways, where because you know you want to buy a good system and maybe, you know, country X has done it. So you do want that vendor at the table bidding, but you might want it with a local women-led firm or a local civil society women-led, and so on. how do these matches don't naturally happen, right, for this relationship? And again, the government with its convening power, matchmaking power, needs to do that whole ecosystem building well before it comes to the day before procurement. At that point, I think it's too late.
If I can add to that, because I totally agree with you. And in the case of Barcelona, was, you know, where I was before, and we were doing this type of work with cities, is a reality, you know, because if you think about procurement is about managing risk. It's public money. You don't want to get it wrong. You have to get the service you need at the right cost, and you have to make sure that the vendor has the ability to deliver what they are promising. So it's about managing risk. So, you know, the biggest challenge is always when you're starting up is the professionality, you know, it's like kind of level of formalization. How much have you done this? And one of the ways that often you create kind of massive barriers for smaller vendors or new vendors is kind of the financial backlog. So, you know, here, for example, they ask you for demonstrate that you had X amount of revenue in the past year. And that is a way that sometimes it doesn't matter that you're not good at the work you do, but you don't have the scale that transmits trust to government that you're going to be able to deliver the work they are asking. So that puts you out of the picture. So I totally agree that we really have to understand what are the challenges, the points, that the pain points to enter the procurement ecosystem with government and help to reduce those challenges. It can be simplify the forms, simplify the financial requisites that you have, simplify the process. You know, when we work with the local governments in procurement process, sometimes it's just the overburden of administrative work that sometimes you take it out and the value remains there. So it's a, you know, the government should, what you were saying with the citizen, you know, simplify, treat your citizen as your kind of client in a sense that help understand the process and what their needs are. The same would apply to the vendors. To kind of streamline the entire process and lower the entry barriers if you want to diversify this ecosystem of vendors, but also who are the face of those vendors, no?
Yeah, absolutely. So what are the next, just as we start to wrap up here, what do we think the most important next steps are to get us to our endpoint?
I think particularly when it comes to bias of certain groups, including women and otherwise marginalized, who is at the table is absolutely important, as we all agree. Now, it doesn't mean automatically just because you have a female-led firm, you're going to get unbiased systems. But you're more likely to have people asking tough questions and good questions if you have diverse backgrounds in your software development teams, in your procurement teams, and so on and so forth. So diversity of experience and opinion, and diversity of interest, the multi-stakeholderism in the procurement process is really important. And it's multidisciplinary is good. Of course, you need the different disciplines, but multi-stakeholderism, I would say, is even more important, because multidiscipline is you can have the same viewpoint, but look at it from an anthropological versus AI versus mathematical point of view. But multi-stakeholderism is really fundamental. Who represents the interest of who, right? And systems that from beginning to end have multi-stakeholderism built in and diverse viewpoints, I think, are more likely to build slightly less biased systems, or systems that can correct themselves over time. So I think acceptance of that viewpoint is important, and it's hard. Second, recognizing, I think, that government actually doesn't have a lot of the capacity to do quite sophisticated analysis of systems. That's the other reason to bring other stakeholders in, right? Capacity in a lot of the countries that we work in is incredibly low. Even in procurement is low. Certainly in systems and audits and understanding bias, it's really quite low. Third, I think you might, you know, I'm a believer in public-private partnerships, civil society partnerships. But in the end, the only people you can vote out is the government. You can't, you private sector is accountable to its shareholders. So accountability stops at government. The government needs to deal with its relationship with private sector and figure out how that works when they are held to account. But citizens have to be able to hold government to account on these systems. So,
fabulous points. Fabulous points. Carina?
Well, adding to that, I'm trying to think what are the 3 things that we need to do in the next 6 months. So in 12 months, we get together again and we have some results to show. I really think we need to identify an ambassador. Who is the progressive city leader that is open for us to go and try things out? Give me your city as your playing ground. Let us try to do a few pilots. So we really need an ambassador. That's, for me, will be the first step. The second step is really identify an area where we can create impact. You were talking earlier, Caitlin, it's just, okay, welfare services, we know it's a quick win, in the sense that we know that a lot of the beneficiaries are women because of structural, historic conditions. There might be another ones. I don't know, HR services for big companies, or access to credit. We know that's also been historically another area that is very sensitive for women, is access to loans and credit, both in the developed and developing countries. So identify that key area where we want to really create impact. And the third one, and it might be a bit, polemic, but I really think we need to identify the case and really create, do the same strategy as the Dutch case. We need a strategic litigation, because I think is the best way to get attention to your cause, to really change the system. We need this, you need society support. When we talk about automated decision-making systems, this is so far away from your life as a citizen. In most cases, you encounter these systems, you don't even know that there is not a person making this decision. That this decision was just like a rule setting that has made the decision about what's happening in the next few months for you. So I think we need a strategic litigation case, gender-oriented, that really exposes the challenges that we have when it comes to algorithm and bias in these systems in the public sector, and build our case and build that sensibility in society, but also awareness of the impact these systems are having in our systems, in our lives. And now is the moment, because the same as what Helani was mentioning earlier, even in Europe, you look at these cases and most of them are not very sophisticated, or they have not been in place for many years, or they are at the pilot phase. Now is the moment to create change. If we wait 10, 15 years, it might be too late, because it might take another 10 years to kind of stop them working, and the damage will be too big. But also, usually in governments, what happened, we've seen that in Denmark, but also in the Netherlands, is you start using it in a city, low profile city, you do a pilot, it goes well, you move it to kind of mid-sized cities, and by the time you realize that there's an issue there, it's, you already have a lot of municipalities, so it's already a major program at the government level, and it's much, much harder to put the brake and to activate the brake and question the use of that system. And just adding one line, because I think it's really important, we need to start talking about, do we really need all this complexity? It's one thing that I keep reading. It might be that we are making, digitalizing things that could be done in a much simpler way. And I think we have to start questioning continuously, when we do a digitalization of a process, do we really need all this data? Do we really need all of this in order to take this decision? Because it's going to create more and more challenges to all of us at different levels of our lives.
Yeah, I mean, look, I promised that it would be exciting, and actually it is. There are just like so many ideas that are just like bouncing around, and I think we have delivered on them. In terms of what you just said, I think that if we relook at these processes and we decide that it's about creating either effectiveness or better quality of life, it could be that they're not digital at all, right? It's about just supplying fabulous service, and maybe AI, maybe ADM is a way to go, maybe it's not, but we should be looking when we're creating these. This is a moment for us to relook at everything that we're doing, revisit our assumptions, try and revisit the models, rebuild them, and to create something else which might be analog, might be digital, but just is better and better more. So it's not building back better, but it's really rebuilding completely. I mean, we've heard about multi-stakeholder. I love what you said about multi-stakeholders all the way through the process, and that it's not only multidisciplinary, but it's really this multidimensionality of the stakeholders is really what's going to give you value, intellectual input and emotional input and service. That the idea that we're looking for a city and that now is the time. I'm totally 1,000% behind you as we look towards these innovation challenges that you've already had a lot of experience with, so we can go towards innovative procurement, and then hopefully also some set aside so that we can build a new economy that's got women creating and also having the wealth from their creation, and not leaving all of that kind of brilliance behind and putting it on the table as we go forward. So with that, I'm going to say thank you so much, both of you. It's always a delight speaking with you. Could speak to you all day, and we'll speak to you again. And I thank you. So we say goodbye, and thank you for those who have listened. Ciao.
Thank you, Carina, Caitlin. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, Helani, Caitlin. Bye, Jen. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.